September 1945. The occupation of Japan had barely begun, and across the network of American-administered holding facilities and civilian internment camps scattered through the Pacific Theater, a new and unfamiliar routine was establishing itself in the lives of Japanese women who had spent the war's final years inside the absolute certainty of imperial ideology. The camps were not comfortable. They were not designed for comfort. They were designed for order, for processing, for the administrative management of a human consequence of the war's ending that the occupation authority was still developing the procedures to address. But they were, by the documented testimony of the women who passed through them, something that the ideology had not prepared them for. They were places where the rules were explicable, where the treatment was consistent, and where the Americans who administered them behaved with a regularity that resisted the explanation of accident, as though the humanity of the women in their custody was not a philosophical question requiring deliberation, but a practical assumption requiring accommodation. And then, in the third week of September, in a camp in the Western Pacific, an American officer set up a folding table in the compound yard, placed a stack of printed materials on it, and announced, through an interpreter whose own expression suggested he found the announcement somewhat remarkable, that English language instruction was available to any woman who wished to attend, voluntarily, without condition, without obligation, without any stated purpose beyond the provision of a skill that might prove useful. The women looked at the table. They looked at the materials. They looked at each other with the particular economy of expression that years of enforced restraint had made their natural register. And then, one by one, with the careful deliberateness of people testing weight-bearing ice, they sat down. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that history almost forgot, and we find them every week. To understand why the offer of English instruction constituted a shock rather than a convenience, one must understand the ideological framework inside which language itself had been organized during the years of Imperial Japan's wartime mobilization. Language, in that framework, was not neutral. The English language specifically had been the subject of a sustained campaign of cultural suppression through the late 1930s and into the war years, a campaign that had progressed from discouragement to prohibition with the accelerating logic of wartime nationalism seeking to define itself by the elimination of everything associated with the enemy. English words that had entered Japanese commercial and cultural life through decades of international exchange were replaced by Japanese equivalents or simply excised. The teaching of English in schools had been curtailed and in some contexts eliminated. The public use of English had been marked, with increasing explicitness, as a form of cultural disloyalty, an attachment to the enemy's civilization that a properly committed Japanese citizen should have severed along with every other connection to the world that the war was being fought to supersede. For Japanese women who had been educated inside this framework, English was not simply a foreign language. It was a prohibited one, prohibited not by a single law, but by the accumulated weight of social expectation, institutional pressure, and the implicit understanding that attachment to the enemy's tongue was a form of ideological contamination. Some of the older women in the camps had studied English before the war, in the brief period of the 1920s and early 1930s when Japan's international orientation had made foreign language education a mark of education and sophistication. That knowledge had been quietly suppressed, stored in the private interior of the mind where the things one did not display in public were kept, maintained in silence because the silence was the price of its preservation. The younger women had in most cases never been formally taught the language at all. They had grown up in the wartime educational environment in which English was the enemy's tongue, and the enemy's tongue was not a thing a loyal Japanese woman placed in her mouth. The American officer who set up the folding table in the compound yard was not, by any account, a man engaged in a deliberate act of ideological rehabilitation. He was a practical man addressing a practical problem. The difficulty of administering a camp in which communication between administrators and inhabitants required the constant mediation of interpreters who were in short supply and whose translations, however competent, introduced delays and ambiguities into every interaction that complicated the basic work of running a facility with some degree of efficiency. If the women could learn enough English to manage routine interactions, the administrative burden would be reduced. The reasoning was organizational. The consequences were something considerably larger. What the women encountered in those English lessons was not only a language. They encountered, embedded in the structure and the content of the instruction, a set of assumptions about the person being instructed that differed fundamentally from the assumptions they had been living inside. The instruction was patient. It did not punish error. It proceeded at a pace calibrated to the learner's progress rather than to the institutional convenience of the instructor. The American officer or the NCO conducting the lesson. Accounts vary on who precisely taught in different camps and at different times. Corrected mistakes without the emotional charge that error had carried in the Japanese educational environments most of the women had experienced, where mistakes were occasions for shame, and shame was the primary pedagogical instrument. The correction came and went without residue. The next attempt was met with the same even attention as the first. The learning was allowed to be a process rather than a performance. This pedagogical texture was not accidental. It was the expression of an educational culture that had, through the preceding decades, moved significantly toward an understanding of learning as an activity that functioned best in conditions of psychological safety, conditions in which the learner's confidence was a resource to be protected rather than a luxury to be deferred until competence was demonstrated. American public education in the 1930s and 1940s was not uniformly enlightened in this respect, and the conditions of a military camp were not the conditions of a peacetime classroom. But the baseline assumption that the person being taught was a capable human being whose capacity to learn was the starting point rather than the thing to be proven was sufficiently different from the baseline assumption of the Japanese wartime educational environment that its presence was perceptible even to women who had no framework for naming what they were perceiving. The documented responses of women who attended these English lessons in the weeks following the occupation's establishment move through a consistent pattern in the memoir and oral history record. The initial sessions were marked by self-consciousness, by the particular vulnerability of adults learning in public a skill that children acquire, by the awareness that stumbling over foreign sounds in front of others was a form of exposure that the culture of Gammon had trained them to avoid. But the self-consciousness diminished faster than most of the women expected because the conditions did not sustain it. The instructor did not amplify it. The other women in the lessons, navigating the same vulnerability, became not an audience for failure, but companions in a shared difficulty, which is a different thing entirely, and which produces, in human beings who have been isolated by circumstance and ideology, a social warmth that the formal distance of the camp's administrative structure had not previously permitted. By the fourth and fifth weeks, something had shifted in the character of the lessons that went beyond the acquisition of vocabulary and basic grammatical structure. The women were not merely learning English. They were discovering, through the specific medium of a second language, that the world was larger than the single linguistic and ideological framework through which they had been required to experience it. A language is not only a communication system. It is a structure of categories, of relationships, of ways of organizing experience into expressible form. English organized certain experiences differently than Japanese did. It offered certain distinctions that Japanese obscured and obscured certain distinctions that Japanese made explicit. Learning it was not simply adding a tool to a kit. It was at some level that the women themselves described with varying degrees of articulateness, discovering that the kit itself was not the only possible kit, that the way one had always organized experience was one way rather than the way, and that other ways existed and were navigable and did not require the abandonment of the first way to be explored. The chocolate bar that appeared in the camp in those same weeks, distributed through Red Cross packages with the casual abundance of a supply system that had never been broken, carried its familiar argument about the productive depth of the civilization offering it. But the English lesson offered something the chocolate could not the abundance of things, but the abundance of possibility. The chocolate said this nation has enough to share even with those it has defeated. The English lesson said this nation believes that those it has defeated are capable of growth and worth the investment of teaching. The distinction was not trivial. One was generosity toward the body. The other was a form of respect for the mind, a recognition implicit in the act of instruction itself, that the women being taught were not merely objects of administrative management, but subjects of their own development, capable of acquiring new skills and new frameworks and new ways of being in the world that the war and its ideology had not permitted them to imagine. The transformation documented in survivor accounts was gradual and uneven, as genuine transformations always are. Some women engaged with the English lessons with an appetite that surprised themselves. Others attended irregularly, constrained by the persistent weight of the ideological prohibition they had internalized, uncertain whether the acquisition of the enemy's language was an act of survival or an act of betrayal, navigating the space between those two interpretations with the careful deliberateness of people for whom the cost of a wrong judgment had recently been very high. A small number did not attend at all, maintaining in the English lesson a boundary that the chocolate and the permission to sing had not prompted them to draw. The camp contained all of these responses simultaneously, because human beings confronting the dissolution of foundational certainties do not move in formation. But the accounts that survive are consistent on the question of what the offer itself communicated, independent of whether any individual woman accepted it. The offer said that the future was open, that the skills of the future were learnable, that the Americans who administered the camps saw in the women before them not a defeated population to be managed until they could be repatriated, but human beings whose capacities extended beyond what the war had allowed them to develop, and whose development was a legitimate object of investment even here, even now, even in a camp in the Western Pacific in the autumn of 1945. The offer was practical in its origin. It was profound in its implication. And the women who sat down at the folding table and picked up the printed materials and began, with the particular courage of adults doing something new in public, to sound out the words of a language they had been told was the enemy's. Those women were not simply acquiring a skill. They were crossing a boundary that the ideology had placed between themselves and a portion of the human world. They were discovering that the boundary had always been constructed rather than natural. And they were discovering it in a language that the construction had told them they were not permitted to speak. If this story stayed with you, and we believe it did, leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you have not already. The stories that change how we see the world are the ones worth keeping, and we will keep finding them.